In a world where uniforms determine worth and rank dictates respect, some of the most extraordinary people walk among us completely invisible. They clean our floors while we step over them, serve our food while we scroll our phones, and keep our institutions running while we pretend they don't exist. But what happens when someone with real power sees what everyone else has chosen to ignore? This is the true story of Maria Santos, a 52-year-old custodial worker who spent 7 years mopping the floors of the Pentagon, invisible to thousands of military personnel who passed her daily. And General Patricia Matthews, a 4-star general who would do something so unexpected, so profound, that it would change not just one woman's life, but challenge an entire system built on hierarchy and assumptions. Sometimes the most powerful act of leadership isn't commanding troops or making strategic decisions. Sometimes it's simply seeing someone that everyone else has forgotten exists. This is that story. Maria Santos arrived at the Pentagon every morning at 4:30 a.m., long before the building came alive with the footsteps of thousands of military personnel and government officials. She preferred these quiet hours when the hallways echoed only with the soft swish of her mop and the gentle hum of the floor buffer. In the darkness, she could work without feeling the weight of being unseen, without the sting of eyes that looked through her as if she were part of the furniture. At 52, Maria had been cleaning these same corridors for 7 years. She knew every corner, every scuff mark, every place where coffee stains appeared with predictable regularity. Her calloused hands had polished these floors until they gleamed like mirrors, reflecting the hurried faces of people who never bothered to look down at the woman who made their workplace shine. Maria had not planned for this life. 20 years earlier, she had been Dr. Maria Elena Santos, a brilliant pediatrician practicing in a small hospital outside San Salvador. She had graduated top of her medical class, spoke 4 languages fluently, and had dedicated her life to treating children who couldn't afford proper medical care. Her patients' families would bring her homemade tortillas and hand-picked flowers, calling her Doctora Angel for the way she could calm a crying child with just her gentle touch. But when the violence in El Salvador escalated in the early 2000s, when drug cartels began targeting educated professionals for kidnapping and extortion, Maria faced an impossible choice: stay and risk not just her own life, but the lives of her 2 teenage daughters, or leave everything behind and start over in a country where her medical degree meant nothing without years of expensive recertification she couldn't afford. The decision nearly broke her. The day she locked her clinic door for the last time, she sat in her car and wept until she had no tears left. 20 years of education, 15 years of practice, hundreds of children she had healed, all of it reduced to worthless paper in a foreign land. She had arrived in Washington, D.C. with her daughters, Rosa and Carmen, carrying 3 suitcases and $800 in cash. The American dream felt more like a nightmare those first months. Maria spoke excellent English, but her accent marked her as foreign. Her medical degree was recognized nowhere. The licensing process would take years and cost more than $50,000, money she didn't have when she was sleeping on her cousin's couch and rationing meals to make sure her daughters could eat. The Pentagon custodial job came through a staffing agency that specialized in placing immigrants in cleaning positions. The pay was better than most janitorial work, and it came with health insurance, something Maria valued more than most people could understand, having spent years treating uninsured patients who arrived at her clinic with preventable conditions that had become life-threatening. Her supervisor, a tired-looking man named Bob Richardson, had given her the standard orientation on her first day. "Keep your head down, do your work, and don't bother anyone," he had said, handing her a uniform and a security badge. "These are important people here. They don't want to be disturbed by the help." Maria had nodded, understanding that she was entering a world where her previous life as a respected doctor was not just irrelevant, it was actively discouraged. She was to be invisible, efficient, and forgettable. Just another brown face in a blue uniform pushing a cart through hallways where decisions affecting millions of lives were made daily. The work itself was not difficult for someone who had once performed delicate surgeries. Mopping floors required less precision than suturing a child's torn artery. But the mental adjustment proved harder than any physical challenge. Maria, who had once been consulted by colleagues across 3 countries, now moved through her days without speaking to anyone except to murmur, "Excuse me," when she needed to clean around someone's feet. Her daughters adapted to their new life with the resilience of youth, but Maria could see the confusion in their eyes. Rosa, now 17, had been planning to study medicine like her mother. Carmen, 15, had shown remarkable talent in mathematics and dreamed of becoming an engineer. In El Salvador, these dreams had seemed natural, inevitable. In America, living in a cramped apartment in a neighborhood where gunshots were more common than her daughter's laughter, those dreams felt fragile and uncertain. The Pentagon became Maria's refuge in an unexpected way. The building's history gave her work meaning beyond simple cleaning. She was maintaining a place where decisions were made that affected people around the world, including people in countries like the one she had fled. When she polished the memorial walls honoring fallen service members, she thought of the doctors and teachers and shopkeepers in El Salvador who had also given their lives, though their names would never be etched in marble. Maria developed her own rituals to maintain dignity in work that others might find demeaning. She learned the names of everyone whose offices she cleaned, even though they didn't know hers. She memorized the photos on their desks, children playing soccer, family vacation shots, graduation pictures. These glimpses into their personal lives reminded her that everyone, regardless of rank or position, was human. She also began to understand the rhythms and hierarchies of the Pentagon in ways that might have surprised the people who walked past her. 7 years of quiet observation had taught her which generals were respected by their subordinates and which were feared. She knew which offices generated the most stress, which meetings ran late, and which departments had the highest turnover. Information flowed around her like water around a stone, and she absorbed it all while remaining officially invisible. The physical demands of the job had strengthened her in unexpected ways. Her hands, once steady enough to perform surgery, had become even steadier from years of precise cleaning. Her back, which had ached from long hours bent over examining children, had grown stronger from lifting equipment and pushing heavy carts. But it was her spirit that bore the heaviest burden. Some nights, Maria would sit at her kitchen table helping Rosa with college applications, using English that was more sophisticated than most native speakers could manage, and feel the weight of her invisible days. She would look at her daughter's essays about overcoming adversity and wonder if she had made the right choice. Had she saved her daughters from physical danger only to trap them all in a different kind of prison? Rosa was applying to pre-med programs, but the family's financial situation made even state schools seem impossibly expensive. Carmen's math scores could have earned her scholarships, but the guidance counselor at their underfunded high school knew little about opportunities for immigrant students. Maria found herself working longer shifts, picking up weekend hours, trying to save money that seemed to disappear as quickly as she earned it. The irony was not lost on her that she spent her days cleaning the offices of people who made decisions about immigration policy, healthcare, and education, all issues that directly affected her family's future. She had once been the kind of person who would have been invited to give expert testimony before Congress about healthcare in developing nations. Now she emptied the trash cans of people who might never think to ask for her opinion on anything more complex than the best cleaning products to use on marble floors. But Maria had learned something during her years of being invisible that she had never understood when she was Dr. Santos. She had learned to see other invisible people. The security guards who worked double shifts to support families back home. The food service workers who smiled through exhaustion. The maintenance staff who kept the massive building functioning while remaining nameless to those they served. These people became her community. They shared information about second jobs, about which supervisors were fair and which were cruel, about immigration lawyers and English classes and scholarship opportunities for their children. They celebrated each other's small victories, a son's graduation, a green card approved, a daughter accepted to college, with a joy that the powerful people upstairs might have found touching if they had bothered to notice. Maria's English had improved dramatically over the years, not just from necessity, but from listening to the conversations of educated people as she worked around them. She found herself understanding complex discussions about military strategy, foreign policy, and government operations. Sometimes she wanted to interject, to share insights from her experience treating refugees from various conflicts, or to correct misconceptions about conditions in Central America. But she had learned to keep her mouth shut and her opinions to herself. The closest she came to breaking her invisibility was during a late evening shift when she was cleaning a conference room after a meeting about humanitarian aid to Latin America. The officials had left behind papers covered with statistics about medical needs in refugee camps, numbers that Maria knew were grossly underestimated based on her own experience. For a moment, she considered leaving a note, sharing her knowledge anonymously. But The risk was too great. Immigrant custodial workers who overstepped their boundaries didn't just get fired. They could be reported to immigration authorities for security violations. So Maria continued her routine, arriving before dawn, working efficiently through her assigned areas, and leaving after most of the day's shift had gone home. She knew the building's secrets, which offices stayed late working on classified projects, which meetings ran over budget discussions, which departments were understaffed and overworked. She had become an expert in reading the mood of the building from subtle signs, the tension level in voices, the number of coffee cups left behind after long meetings, the frequency of phone calls to family members during stressful periods. Her supervisor Bob had come to trust her completely. Maria never called in sick, never left work undone, and never caused problems. She was, in his words, the best cleaner we've ever had. But Bob's praise came with an edge of sadness that he probably didn't recognize. He had reduced a former doctor to being valued primarily for her ability to clean without causing trouble. As Maria entered her 8th year at the Pentagon, she had settled into a rhythm of resignation mixed with quiet hope. Rosa was starting her sophomore year of college on a combination of financial aid and student loans that would take decades to repay. Carmen was applying to engineering programs with test scores that impressed admissions counselors, though the family's financial situation remained precarious. Maria had learned to find satisfaction in small things. The way sunlight streamed through the windows she had cleaned, the grateful nod from a young soldier whose office she had straightened after a difficult day, the quiet pride of maintaining a workspace where important decisions were made. She had made peace with being invisible, understanding that dignity could be maintained even when recognition was absent. But what Maria didn't know was that someone had been watching her. Someone who would soon challenge everything she had accepted about her place in this building, her value as a person, and the assumptions that kept her invisible. The encounter that would change everything was only days away, and it would begin with something as simple as a spilled cup of coffee and a 4-star general who chose to see what everyone else had ignored. The stage was set for a moment that would prove that sometimes the most powerful people are those who recognize power in unexpected places, and that true leadership often begins with the simple act of treating every person as if they matter. Maria Santos was about to discover that being invisible doesn't mean being worthless, and that sometimes it takes someone with real authority to reveal the authority that has been there all along. General Patricia Matthews had earned her 4th star through 3 decades of military service that had taken her from a second lieutenant fresh out of West Point to one of the most respected officers in the United States Army. At 58, she commanded the respect of subordinates and superiors alike, not through intimidation or political maneuvering, but through a leadership style that combined strategic brilliance with an unusual attention to the human elements that most senior officers overlooked. Unlike many of her peers who had spent their careers focused upward on the next promotion, Patricia had developed a habit of looking in all directions. She noticed the junior officers who worked late to master their responsibilities. She remembered the names of the enlisted personnel who kept her operations running smoothly. She understood that an army's strength came not just from its generals, but from every person who contributed to the mission, regardless of rank or visibility. This awareness had been shaped by her own unlikely journey to the top of military hierarchy. Patricia had grown up in a working-class family in rural Ohio, the daughter of a factory worker and a school custodian. Her mother, Dorothy Matthews, had cleaned the same elementary school for 22 years, arriving before dawn to ensure that children would find their classrooms spotless and welcoming. Patricia had often accompanied her mother to work during school breaks, helping with simple tasks and learning lessons about pride in work that had nothing to do with prestige or recognition. "Baby girl," her mother had often said while mopping classroom floors, "there's no such thing as unimportant work, only unimportant attitudes about work. These children deserve a clean place to learn, and I make sure they get it. That matters." Those early morning hours spent watching her mother transform chaotic classrooms into organized learning environments had taught Patricia something that West Point leadership courses couldn't: that the people who keep institutions functioning are often the least visible and the most essential. When she looked at organizational charts later in her military career, she instinctively understood that the real work happened in the spaces between the boxes, performed by people whose names appeared nowhere on official documents. General Matthews had arrived at the Pentagon 18 months earlier to oversee military logistics operations worldwide. Her office was located on the 2nd floor, in a section of the building that housed some of the most senior military leadership. The assignment was both an honor and a challenge. She was responsible for ensuring that American military forces around the globe had the supplies, equipment, and support they needed to accomplish their missions. The complexity of the role was staggering. On any given day, Patricia might coordinate supply chains stretching from manufacturing facilities in Ohio to forward operating bases in Afghanistan. She managed budgets in the hundreds of billions, oversaw personnel numbering in the hundreds of thousands, and made decisions that could affect the outcome of military operations on multiple continents. The responsibility was immense, and the margin for error was essentially zero. But what set General Matthews apart from many of her peers was her understanding that successful logistics depended on attention to detail at every level, including levels that most senior officers never considered. She knew that a supply chain was only as strong as its weakest link, and that weakness could appear anywhere, from a miscommunication in a Pentagon office to a broken-down truck on a road in Iraq. This philosophy extended to how she interacted with everyone in her work environment. Patricia made it a point to learn the names of the security guards who checked her identification each morning. She knew which cleaning staff worked in her section of the building, and she had noticed that they changed schedules frequently due to the demands of maintaining such a large facility around the clock. What she had not noticed, until recently, was the consistent presence of one particular custodial worker who seemed to be responsible for the areas around her office. This woman worked with an efficiency and attention to detail that impressed Patricia, who had spent her career evaluating performance and identifying excellence wherever it appeared. The cleaning woman, Patricia realized with some embarrassment that she didn't know her name, arrived early, and worked systematically through each area. Her work was thorough without being slow, careful without being obsessive. The floors gleamed, the windows were spotless, and even small details like the arrangement of furniture and the emptying of waste baskets were handled with a precision that Patricia, as a military officer, could appreciate. But it wasn't just the quality of the work that caught Patricia's attention. It was the way the woman moved through her duties with a kind of quiet dignity that suggested she took pride in what she did, regardless of how others might view it. Patricia had seen this quality in some of her best soldiers, people who understood that excellence was a personal standard, not something dependent on external recognition or reward. General Matthews had also begun to notice something else that troubled her: the way other people in the building interacted with the custodial staff. Or rather, the way they didn't interact at all. She watched officers and civilian employees walk past cleaning personnel as if they were furniture, never making eye contact, never offering a greeting, never acknowledging their presence except to occasionally complain if a bathroom wasn't spotless or a floor wasn't dry enough. This behavior violated everything Patricia had learned about leadership from her mother and from her own military experience. In her units, she had always insisted that every person be treated with respect, regardless of their position in the hierarchy. She had court-martialed officers who abused enlisted personnel and promoted sergeants who looked out for the soldiers under their command. The idea that anyone working in the Pentagon, regardless of their job, should be treated as invisible was antithetical to her understanding of how organizations should function. The breaking point came on a Tuesday morning in October. General Matthews was running late for a briefing on supply chain vulnerabilities in Eastern Europe. She had stayed up until midnight reviewing classified reports and had overslept by 20 minutes, a rarity for someone whose military discipline typically had her awake before her alarm clock. She was walking quickly down the corridor toward the briefing room, carrying a cup of coffee and a stack of classified folders, when she encountered a situation that would change everything. The custodial worker she had been observing was cleaning near the briefing room, moving her equipment cart to make way for the steady stream of military personnel heading to various meetings. Patricia watched as a young lieutenant colonel, apparently also running late, pushed past the cleaning cart without acknowledgement, causing it to roll into the woman's hip. The impact wasn't severe, but it was clearly painful, and the woman had to steady herself against the wall. The lieutenant colonel didn't apologize, didn't even look back, just continued walking while checking his phone. What happened next revealed something that made Patricia stop in her tracks. Instead of complaining or showing any annoyance, the custodial worker immediately moved to check if the cart had scuffed the wall or floor. Her first concern wasn't her own comfort, but whether the impact had caused any damage to the building she was responsible for maintaining. Then, Patricia heard her speak for the first time. The woman was talking quietly to herself in what sounded like Spanish, and even though Patricia didn't understand the language, The tone was one of gentle reassurance rather than anger or frustration. It was the voice of someone who had learned to absorb small indignities without letting them diminish her spirit. General Matthews felt a surge of anger at the lieutenant colonel's behavior. But, more than that, she felt ashamed of her own. She had spent weeks observing this woman's excellent work, noting her dignity and professionalism, but she had never once acknowledged her directly. She had been guilty of the same behavior she was criticizing in others. Patricia made a decision that would prove more significant than most of the strategic choices she made in her official capacity. She approached the custodial worker, who looked up with the expression Patricia had seen on countless subordinates who weren't sure if they were about to be praised or reprimanded by a senior officer. "Excuse me," Patricia said, and was surprised by how nervous she felt. Commanding troops in combat situations felt easier than this simple human interaction. "I wanted to apologize for that officer's behavior. That was unacceptable." The woman looked confused, as if she wasn't sure why a general would be talking to her at all. "Is okay," she said in accented English. "No problem. It is a problem," Patricia replied. "And I realized I don't know your name. I see you working in this area regularly, and your work is excellent. I should have introduced myself before now." The woman seemed even more confused now, looking around as if she thought the general might be talking to someone else. "I am Maria," she said finally. "Maria Santos. I'm General Matthews," Patricia said, extending her hand. "Thank you for keeping our work environment so clean and organized. It makes a difference." Maria shook her hand with the kind of firm grip that surprised Patricia. This wasn't the handshake of someone accustomed to being dismissed or ignored. It was the handshake of someone who understood professional courtesy, even if she hadn't been receiving much of it lately. But what happened next would prove even more revealing. As Patricia was about to continue to her briefing, she heard raised voices coming from the conference room she was supposed to be entering. Through the partially open door, she could see several officers gathered around a table covered with maps and documents, engaged in what appeared to be a heated discussion. "The medical infrastructure in these refugee camps is completely inadequate," one voice was saying. "Our intelligence reports are useless. We need reliable information about actual conditions on the ground." Patricia paused, recognizing this as the briefing she was supposed to be attending. The discussion was about humanitarian aid operations in Central America, an area where military logistics support was being requested to help with refugee crisis management. What she heard next stopped her completely. Maria, who was still standing nearby with her cleaning cart, made a soft sound, almost a sigh of frustration. When Patricia looked at her, she saw an expression that was completely different from the submissive demeanor she had expected. Maria was listening to the conversation with the focused attention of someone who understood exactly what was being discussed. "You know something about this," Patricia said quietly. It wasn't a question. Maria looked startled, as if she hadn't realized her reaction was visible. She glanced around nervously, clearly aware that custodial workers weren't supposed to eavesdrop on military briefings, even accidentally. Maria began, then stopped. Patricia could see her struggling with something, weighing risks and benefits with the kind of careful calculation that suggested this woman was far more complex than her job title indicated. "It's okay," Patricia said. "What were you thinking?" Maria looked at the general for a long moment, as if trying to assess whether this was genuine interest or some kind of test. Finally, she spoke in a voice that was quiet but held a certainty that surprised Patricia. "The numbers they use for medical supplies in camps, they are wrong. Too low. In reality, you need much more medicine for children, more antibiotics, more supplies for surgery. When people have traveled for weeks, many are sick, not just hungry." Patricia stared at her. This wasn't the kind of general comment someone might make based on news reports. This was specific, detailed knowledge spoken with the confidence of direct experience. "How do you know that?" Patricia asked. Maria hesitated again, and Patricia could see her making another calculation about risk versus honesty. "I was doctor," she said finally, "in El Salvador. I worked with refugees before, when violence was bad." The words hit Patricia like a physical blow. This woman, who had been invisible to everyone in the building, who was dismissed as just another custodial worker, was a medical doctor with direct experience in exactly the kind of humanitarian crisis being discussed in the briefing room. Patricia felt her worldview shift in that moment. How many other invisible people in this building had knowledge and experience that could be valuable? How many insights were being lost because people like her had learned to look through rather than at the people who kept their institution functioning? The briefing room door opened, and a colonel appeared. "General Matthews? We're ready to start." Patricia looked at the colonel, then at Maria, then back at the colonel. She was about to make a decision that would violate protocol, challenge assumptions, and possibly change the entire dynamic of how the Pentagon approached problems that required diverse perspectives and real-world experience. "Colonel," she said, "I'd like to bring someone into this briefing. Someone with relevant expertise." The colonel looked puzzled, scanning the hallway for the expert he expected to see. His eyes passed right over Maria, just as thousands of other eyes had done over the past 7 years. "Ma'am," he said. General Matthews took a deep breath, understanding that what she did next would define not just this moment, but her own understanding of what leadership really meant. "I'd like you to meet Dr. Maria Santos," she said. The silence that followed General Matthews' introduction seemed to stretch forever. Colonel Jenkins stood in the briefing room doorway, his expression cycling through confusion, disbelief, and barely concealed alarm. Behind him, Patricia could see other officers turning to look toward the hallway, trying to understand why their briefing had been interrupted by what appeared to be a conversation with the cleaning staff. Maria felt her heart racing so fast she thought it might be visible through her uniform. 7 years of carefully maintained invisibility were about to end, and she wasn't sure whether what came next would be salvation or disaster. Her hands, steady enough to have performed thousands of medical procedures, trembled slightly as she gripped the handle of her cleaning cart. "General," Colonel Jenkins said carefully, "I think there may be some confusion. This is a classified briefing about humanitarian operations in Central America. I believe you're referring to someone who isn't here yet." Patricia felt a moment of doubt. What she was about to do was unprecedented, possibly career-threatening, and definitely against protocol. Pentagon security clearances didn't extend to custodial staff, regardless of their previous qualifications. But looking at Maria's face, seeing the intelligence and experience in her eyes, Patricia knew that following protocol in this moment would mean ignoring exactly the kind of expertise they desperately needed. "There's no confusion, Colonel," Patricia said, her voice carrying the authority that had commanded respect for 3 decades. "Dr. Santos has relevant experience with humanitarian medical operations in Central America. I believe her insights could be valuable to our discussion." The word "doctor" hit the group like a grenade. Patricia could see the officers in the briefing room exchanging glances, some confused, others skeptical, a few beginning to look interested. The assumption that custodial workers couldn't possess advanced degrees or specialized knowledge was so deeply ingrained that the cognitive dissonance was almost visible. Maria understood that this was her moment to speak or forever remain silent. Years of being invisible had taught her to be cautious, but her daughters' faces flashed in her mind. Rosa struggling with medical school applications she could barely afford, Carmen dreaming of engineering programs that seemed financially impossible. This unexpected opportunity might be their only chance for something better. "General Matthews," she said, her voice stronger now. "I don't have security clearance for classified briefings." "The operational details are classified," Patricia replied. "But the humanitarian aspects we're discussing, medical supply needs, refugee health conditions, logistical challenges, these aren't classified. Your expertise in these areas could help us make better decisions about resource allocation." Colonel Jenkins looked like he was about to object again, but Patricia cut him off with a look that had silenced more senior officers than him. "Colonel, in my experience, good intelligence comes from many sources. Sometimes the most valuable perspectives come from unexpected places." She turned to Maria. "Dr. Santos, would you be willing to share your insights with us?" "Entirely voluntarily, of course." Maria looked at her cleaning cart, at her uniform, at the general who was offering her something she had never dared to hope for. The chance to be useful again in the way she had trained for, the way she had dreamed of since medical school. "Yes," she said simply. Walking into that briefing room felt like entering a different universe. Maria had cleaned this room dozens of times, had emptied trash cans, and polished the long mahogany table around which critical decisions were made. But she had never imagined sitting at that table, never thought she would be asked for her opinion on matters that affected thousands of lives. The room contained 8 officers of various ranks, from major to colonel, plus 2 civilian analysts from the State Department. As Patricia introduced Maria, their reactions ranged from polite skepticism to outright bewilderment. Several continued to glance at her custodial uniform, as if trying to reconcile her appearance with the introduction they had just heard. The briefing materials spread across the table included maps of Central American refugee routes, supply manifests for medical equipment, and intelligence reports about conditions in temporary camps along the U.S.-Mexico border. Maria recognized the geography immediately. Many of these were places she had worked, areas where she had treated patients under conditions that tested every skill she had learned in medical school. Major Rodriguez, a logistics officer, was presenting the supply requirements as Maria sat down. Based on our analysis, we estimate medical needs at approximately 40 pounds of supplies per 100 refugees, focusing primarily on basic first aid materials and antibiotics for gastrointestinal issues. Maria listened for several minutes, taking in the assumptions underlying their calculations. The numbers weren't just wrong, they were dangerously inadequate. But she also understood the political and budgetary pressures that led to such estimates. Military officers were trained to be conservative with resource requests, to justify every expense, to avoid the kind of cost overruns that could end careers. When Major Rodriguez finished his presentation, General Matthews looked directly at Maria. "Dr. Santos, what's your assessment of these supply estimates?" Maria took a breath, understanding that everything she said would be evaluated not just for its content, but for evidence that a custodial worker could possibly have relevant expertise. "The estimates are significantly low," she said. "In my experience treating refugees from violence in El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras, the medical needs are much more complex than basic first aid." "What kind of complexity?" asked Dr. Elizabeth Harper, one of the State Department analysts. "First, malnutrition," Maria replied, slipping into the clinical voice she hadn't used in years. "Not just hunger, but specific nutritional deficiencies that create secondary health problems. Children especially need vitamin supplements, protein sources, and treatment for anemia. This requires different supplies than your current estimate includes." She could see several officers taking notes now, their initial skepticism beginning to give way to attention. "Second, untreated chronic conditions," she continued. "People with diabetes who have been without medication for weeks, hypertensive patients who have been under extreme stress, children with asthma exacerbated by travel conditions. You need diagnostic equipment and a broader range of medications than your list includes." Colonel Jameson, who had been silent until now, leaned forward. "Dr. Santos, what was the scope of your medical practice?" "I operated a clinic serving 3 rural communities," Maria replied. "Approximately 8,000 patients in our coverage area. I was the only doctor within 50 miles, so I treated everything from emergency surgery to prenatal care to elderly patients with multiple chronic conditions." The room had gone completely quiet. Patricia could see the mental calculations happening around the table as officers began to understand that they were talking to someone whose medical experience was broader and deeper than most military doctors, whose understanding of refugee health needs was based on years of direct practice rather than theoretical briefings. "The surgical equipment requirements," Major Rodriguez said. "We estimated basic suturing supplies would be sufficient." Maria shook her head. "You need to plan for emergency surgery capabilities. When people have been walking for weeks, carrying children, sometimes fighting for their lives, they arrive with severe injuries. Infected wounds that need debridement, broken bones that require more than simple splints, women who go into labor under traumatic conditions." She was fully in her element now, the knowledge and instincts developed over 15 years of medical practice taking over. "I performed surgery in my clinic with equipment that cost less than what you spend on basic supply kits, because I knew how to improvise, how to adapt. But refugees in camps don't have that luxury. You need to provide surgical capability, or people will die from treatable conditions." Dr. Harper was writing rapidly. "What about pediatric considerations?" "Children are 60% of most refugee populations," Maria replied immediately. "But they're not just small adults. They dehydrate faster, they're more susceptible to respiratory infections, and they have psychological trauma that manifests in physical symptoms. Your supply ratios should account for children being the majority of patients, not a subset." The questions came faster now, as the officers began to understand they were accessing a database of practical knowledge that no amount of theoretical training could provide. Maria answered with the confidence of someone who had made life and death decisions under resource constraints that these military planners had never imagined. "Dr. Santos," General Matthews said, "if you were designing a medical supply package for a refugee camp of 5,000 people, what would it look like?" Maria was quiet for a moment, mentally organizing the lessons learned from years of treating patients with limited resources. "First, diagnostic capability," she said. "Basic lab equipment for blood work, because malnutrition and dehydration create cascading health problems that you can't treat effectively without understanding what's happening inside the body." She had their complete attention now. The custodial worker they had been prepared to ignore was providing information that could dramatically improve the effectiveness of their humanitarian operations. Second, pediatric-specific supplies comprising at least 60% of your total medical inventory. Children's medicine, smaller surgical instruments, equipment for treating respiratory infections that spread rapidly in camp conditions. Third, mental health support materials. Refugees aren't just physically injured, they're psychologically traumatized. You need supplies and training for treating PTSD, depression, and anxiety, especially in children who have witnessed violence. Colonel Jenkins, who had been most skeptical about Maria's presence, was now asking the most detailed questions. What about supply chain logistics? How do you maintain medical capabilities when you're dealing with uncertain delivery schedules and limited storage facilities? You prioritize multi-purpose supplies, Maria replied. Antibiotics that treat multiple conditions rather than specialized medications. Surgical instruments that can be sterilized and reused. Training materials that help local staff provide basic care so that medical professionals can focus on complex cases. The briefing that was supposed to last 1 hour extended to nearly 3 hours. Maria found herself sketching supply lists on a whiteboard, explaining treatment protocols she had developed for resource-limited environments, and describing logistical solutions she had created when standard procedures weren't available. As the session concluded, General Matthews looked around the table. I think it's clear that Dr. Santos has provided insights that will significantly improve our humanitarian response capabilities. I want to thank her for her time and expertise. The officers gathered their materials, several approaching Maria with follow-up questions, others asking for copies of the supply recommendations she had sketched on the whiteboard. The transformation was remarkable. In the span of 3 hours, she had gone from invisible custodial worker to recognized expert whose advice would influence military operations affecting thousands of lives. But, as the room emptied, Maria felt a familiar anxiety returning. This had been extraordinary, validating, and professionally fulfilling in a way she hadn't experienced in 7 years. But, tomorrow, she would still need to report to her custodial supervisor, still needed to maintain the job that provided health insurance for her family, still lived in the same economic reality that had made her invisible in the first place. General Matthews seemed to understand her concern. As the last officers left the briefing room, she approached Maria with an expression that was both thoughtful and determined. Dr. Santos, she said, I'd like to talk with you about possibilities for the future. What happened here today shouldn't be a one-time occurrence. Your expertise is too valuable to waste on cleaning floors. Maria felt tears threatening for the first time in years. Not tears of sadness, but tears of hope mixed with fear. Hope that maybe, finally, her knowledge and experience might matter again. Fear that this moment might be as fragile as it felt precious. I would like that very much, General, she said. But I have daughters in school, and I need this job. I cannot risk the security we have built. Patricia nodded, understanding the impossible position Maria was in. Extraordinary capability trapped by economic necessity. Expertise hidden by the assumptions others made based on appearance and accent. I understand, Patricia said, and I think I might have some ideas about how to address that. Would you be willing to meet with me again? Perhaps we can find a way to use your skills that doesn't compromise your security. As Maria walked back to her cleaning cart, she felt the weight of possibility and uncertainty in equal measure. For 7 years, she had accepted invisibility as the price of safety. Now, suddenly, she faced the prospect of being seen again. But being seen came with risks that extended far beyond her own comfort. The Pentagon's hallways looked the same as always, but Maria knew that something fundamental had changed. The question was whether that change would lead to opportunity or danger, whether General Matthews could navigate the bureaucratic and cultural barriers that had kept Maria invisible, and whether a custodial worker could transform back into Dr. Santos without losing everything she had worked to protect. General Patricia Matthews had built her career on solving complex logistical problems, but the challenge of transforming Maria Santos from invisible custodial worker to recognized expert would test every leadership skill she had developed over 3 decades. The bureaucratic obstacles weren't just administrative. They were cultural, systemic, and deeply embedded in assumptions about worth, capability, and who deserved to be heard. Patricia spent the evening after the briefing researching precedents for what she wanted to accomplish. Pentagon regulations were clear about security clearances, contractor relationships, and the procedures for consulting with outside experts. What they didn't address was how to handle the discovery that extraordinary expertise already existed within the building, hidden behind assumptions about immigration, education recognition, and social hierarchy. She also found herself thinking about her mother, Dorothy Matthews, who had cleaned schools for 22 years while possessing a bachelor's degree in education that economic circumstances had prevented her from using for teaching. Dorothy had often spoken about the invisible knowledge workers possessed, the custodian who understood better than anyone how building systems functioned, the cafeteria worker who knew which children weren't eating lunch because they couldn't afford it, the security guard who could read the social dynamics of a workplace better than any manager. Baby girl, her mother had once said, the people who keep institutions running know things that the people who run institutions never think to ask about. But nobody asks because they think knowing how to clean a floor means you don't know anything else. Patricia realized that Maria represented something larger than an individual case. She represented all the wasted human capital that existed within systems designed to value credentials over capability, appearance over expertise, and social status over actual knowledge. The question was whether one general, even a four-star general, could challenge institutional assumptions deeply enough to create real change. The next morning, Patricia called a meeting with her chief of staff, Colonel Sarah Mitchell, and her senior logistics coordinator, Lieutenant Colonel David Park. Both were officers she trusted completely, people who had demonstrated the kind of flexible thinking that would be essential for what she was planning. I need to discuss an unconventional situation, Patricia began. Yesterday, I discovered that one of the custodial workers in our section is a former medical doctor with extensive experience in exactly the kind of humanitarian operations we're supporting in Central America. Colonel Mitchell raised an eyebrow. Security clearance issues? She doesn't have clearance for classified materials, Patricia replied. But much of what we're dealing with isn't classified. It's humanitarian logistics, medical supply planning, refugee health management. Areas where her expertise is directly relevant and potentially invaluable. Lieutenant Colonel Park leaned forward. Ma'am, are you talking about bringing a custodial worker into policy discussions? I'm talking about recognizing that a person's job title doesn't necessarily reflect their qualifications, Patricia said. Dr. Santos provided insights yesterday that will improve our humanitarian response capabilities. The question is how we can access that expertise systematically rather than accidentally. She could see both officers struggling with the concept. Not because they were particularly rigid, but because the idea of consulting with someone in a custodial position was so far outside normal procedures that they had no framework for understanding how it would work. What kind of arrangement are you considering? Colonel Mitchell asked. That's what I need to figure out, Patricia replied. Traditional consulting contracts require security clearances and formal credentials recognition that could take months or years. But this woman has knowledge we need now, and her current position gives her unique insights into how this building actually functions. Patricia outlined what she had learned about Maria's background, her medical training, her experience treating refugees, and the quality of insights she had provided during the briefing. As she spoke, she could see both officers beginning to understand the magnitude of untapped expertise they were discussing. There's something else, Patricia continued. I suspect Dr. Santos isn't the only person working in non-professional positions who possesses advanced skills. If we can develop a model for recognizing and utilizing hidden expertise, it could transform how we approach problem-solving throughout the Pentagon. Lieutenant Colonel Park was quiet for a moment, then asked, what about resistance from other departments? This kind of unconventional approach could make some people uncomfortable. Some people being uncomfortable is less important than improving our mission effectiveness, Patricia replied. If we can provide better humanitarian support because we're accessing broader expertise, then that's what we should do. Over the following week, Patricia worked with her staff to develop what they privately called the Hidden Expertise Initiative. The plan involved creating a new category of informal consultation that would allow people like Maria to contribute insights without requiring full security clearances or formal contract processes. The arrangement they developed was elegant in its simplicity. Maria would continue her custodial position, maintaining the income and health insurance her family depended on. But she would also be available for informal consultation on humanitarian medical issues, participating in unclassified briefings, and providing input on supply planning and logistics challenges. More importantly, Patricia used her authority to create protected time for these consultations, ensuring that Maria wouldn't be penalized by her custodial supervisor for participating in military planning sessions. She also arranged for Maria to receive compensation for her consulting time at rates comparable to other subject matter experts. When Patricia presented this arrangement to Maria, the response was immediate tears of gratitude mixed with careful questions about sustainability and protection. 7 years of economic vulnerability had taught Maria to be skeptical of arrangements that seemed too good to be true. "General," Maria said, "this is more than I ever hoped for. But what if your commanders don't approve? What if other officers complain? I cannot lose my regular job." "Your job security is protected," Patricia replied. "I've arranged this through my own authority as a general officer. And if anyone has problems with the arrangement, they can discuss those problems with me directly." The first test came sooner than expected. Within days of Maria's new consulting role becoming known, Patricia received a call from General Robert Harrison, the Pentagon's Deputy Chief of Staff for Operations. Harrison was old-school military, someone who believed strongly in proper channels, formal procedures, and maintaining clear distinctions between different categories of personnel. "Pat," Harrison said, using the informal name that indicated both friendship and serious concern, "I'm hearing some unusual reports about your section. Something about consulting with custodial staff on operational planning." Patricia had expected this conversation and had prepared for it carefully. "Bob, I'm utilizing subject matter expertise that happens to exist in an unconventional place. Dr. Santos has medical experience directly relevant to our humanitarian operations. Her insights are improving our effectiveness." "That's not the point," Harrison replied. "There are procedures for bringing in outside experts. Security protocols, vetting processes, formal contract requirements. You can't just decide that someone's qualifications justify bypassing established systems." "I'm not bypassing anything," Patricia said. "I'm using my authority to access expertise for unclassified consultation. Everything we're doing falls within my discretionary powers as a section commander." The conversation continued for 20 minutes, with Harrison expressing concerns about precedent, security implications, and potential reactions from other commands. Patricia understood his worries. They were legitimate questions about how organizations maintain standards and procedures while remaining flexible enough to recognize opportunity. But she also understood something that Harrison might not, that their current procedures were systematically excluding valuable perspectives based on assumptions about where expertise could be found. The choice wasn't between following rules and ignoring them. It was between following rules that served their mission and following rules that limited their effectiveness. "Bob," she said finally, "give me 6 months. If the results don't justify the approach, I'll return to conventional consulting procedures. But if this model improves our capabilities, then maybe it's worth considering how we can implement it more broadly." Harrison agreed to the trial period, but Patricia knew she was being watched carefully. Any mistakes, any security concerns, any complaints from other officers would be magnified because of the unconventional nature of what she was doing. The pressure motivated her to ensure that Maria's contributions were not just valuable, but undeniably excellent. Patricia arranged for Maria to participate in planning sessions for 3 different humanitarian operations over the following months, each time focusing on her areas of greatest expertise. The results exceeded even Patricia's expectations. Maria's medical supply recommendations reduced emergency evacuation needs by 30% in one operation. Her insights into refugee health patterns helped planners anticipate disease outbreaks that conventional intelligence had missed. Her suggestions for working with local medical personnel improved cooperation and effectiveness in areas where American military presence was viewed with suspicion. More importantly, word of Maria's expertise began to spread to other departments. Officers working on different humanitarian operations requested her input. Medical Corps planners asked for her review of treatment protocols. Logistics specialists wanted her assessment of supply chain vulnerabilities. Within 3 months, Maria was consulting on humanitarian operations affecting 4 different regions. Her recommendations were being incorporated into official military planning documents, and her insights were being briefed to senior leadership throughout the Pentagon. But the transformation went beyond professional recognition. Maria's daughters watched their mother return to work she was trained for, using skills she had developed over 15 years of medical practice. Rosa, who had been struggling with the financial pressures of medical school applications, suddenly had access to professional networks through her mother's Pentagon connections. Carmen found engineering mentorship through officers who had been impressed by her mother's analytical capabilities. The change in Maria herself was remarkable. The quiet resignation that had characterized her custodial years was replaced by the confidence of someone whose expertise was valued and whose contributions were making a difference. She began suggesting improvements to Pentagon logistics based on her unique understanding of both the building's operational rhythms and the humanitarian challenges they were addressing. 6 months after their first conversation, General Matthews received a call from General Harrison that she had been hoping for. "Pat," he said, "I need to apologize. This hidden expertise initiative of yours has produced better humanitarian planning than we've seen in years. I'm getting requests from 3 different commands to implement similar programs." "What are you thinking?" Patricia asked. "I'm thinking we need to systematize this approach. Find out what other expertise exists in unconventional places throughout the Pentagon. Create formal pathways for recognizing and utilizing capabilities that our standard procedures miss." Patricia smiled, understanding that Maria's success had created exactly the kind of institutional change she had hoped for. "I'd be happy to help develop those procedures." But the real validation came from an unexpected source. Dr. Maria Santos received an invitation to present her humanitarian medical insights at the Inter-American Defense College, speaking to military officers from throughout Latin America about refugee health management and emergency medical logistics. Standing at the podium in her professional clothes, speaking to an audience of colonels and generals about topics where she was recognized as an expert, Maria represented more than individual success. She represented proof that expertise exists in unexpected places, that institutions work better when they look beyond conventional assumptions about capability, and that sometimes the most important leadership decisions involve simply choosing to see people who have been invisible. As Maria concluded her presentation to enthusiastic applause from military officers from 12 different countries, Patricia sat in the audience thinking about her mother's words about there being no unimportant work, only unimportant attitudes about work. The custodian had become the expert, but, more importantly, the expert had always been there, waiting for someone with enough authority and insight to recognize her value. The question now was how many other invisible experts were still waiting to be seen, and whether the Pentagon's new procedures would find them before their expertise was lost forever. 2 years after that first conversation in the Pentagon hallway, Dr. Maria Santos stood in the Rose Garden of the White House, waiting to receive the Presidential Medal of Freedom for her contributions to humanitarian operations worldwide. The journey from invisible custodial worker to nationally recognized expert had been extraordinary, but the ripple effects of General Matthews' decision to see her had extended far beyond any individual recognition. Maria's transformation had sparked what Pentagon officials now called the hidden expertise revolution, a systematic effort to identify and utilize advanced skills that existed within the building's workforce regardless of official job titles. The program had discovered a former aerospace engineer working in food service, a retired diplomat employed as a security guard, a linguistics professor cleaning offices, and dozens of other highly qualified individuals whose expertise had been hidden by economic necessity and institutional assumptions. The success of these discoveries had prompted similar programs throughout the federal government. Agencies across Washington had begun implementing capability audits designed to identify skills and knowledge that existed within their workforces but weren't being utilized because of rigid job categorizations and assumptions about where expertise could be found. But for Maria, standing in the White House garden in her professional attire, the transformation felt both surreal and inevitable. Surreal because 18 months earlier, she had been mopping these same hallways during late-night cleaning shifts at federal buildings. Inevitable because she had always known that her skills and knowledge existed, even when others couldn't see them. The ceremony itself drew attention to issues that had remained invisible for decades. President Johnson's remarks focused not just on Maria's individual contributions, but on the broader implications of her story for American society. Dr. Santos represents millions of Americans whose talents and expertise are overlooked because of assumptions we make about immigration, education, and economic circumstances, the president said. Her story challenges us to look more carefully at the human resources we're wasting through prejudice and institutional blindness. Sitting in the audience, General Matthews felt a deep satisfaction that had nothing to do with the media attention her unconventional leadership approach had generated. She was thinking about her mother, Dorothy, who had died the previous year, just months before the Hidden Expertise Initiative had been formally adopted as Pentagon policy. Dorothy had lived long enough to see her daughter become a general, but hadn't lived to see the validation of her belief that valuable knowledge existed in unexpected places. After the ceremony, Maria was approached by reporters interested in her personal story, but also by policymakers and business leaders who wanted to understand how her model could be applied in other contexts. The questions revealed how deeply institutional assumptions about capability had affected not just government operations, but private sector efficiency and social justice more broadly. Dr. Santos asked a reporter from the Washington Post, "What would you say to other immigrants who possess advanced skills but are working in positions that don't utilize their education?" Maria considered the question carefully. 2 years of consulting on military operations had given her insights not just into humanitarian logistics, but into the ways that institutions could either waste or leverage human potential. "I would say that your worth is not determined by what others can see," she replied. "But I would also say that individual perseverance is not enough. We need leaders like General Matthews who are willing to look beyond appearances and challenge systems that prevent talented people from contributing their best work." The follow-up question came from a representative of the Harvard Kennedy School, where Maria had recently been invited to lecture on refugee health management. "How do you think institutions can better identify and utilize hidden expertise?" "First, they need to understand that expertise doesn't always come with the credentials they expect," Maria said. "Someone who learned medicine in El Salvador is still a doctor, even if their degree isn't recognized in the United States. Someone who managed complex operations in another country is still a manager, even if they're currently working as a security guard." Second, she continued, institutions need to create pathways for people to demonstrate their capabilities rather than just their credentials. General Matthews gave me an opportunity to show what I knew rather than requiring me to prove it through paperwork. But perhaps the most significant question came from a congressional aide working on immigration policy reform. "Do you think your story represents an isolated success or evidence of systematic problems that need legislative attention?" Maria exchanged glances with General Matthews, who was standing nearby. They had discussed this question many times over the previous months as the Hidden Expertise Initiative had generated national attention. "I think my story represents a small glimpse of a much larger problem," Maria replied. "There are millions of immigrants, veterans, displaced workers, and others whose skills aren't being utilized because our systems for recognizing and deploying human capital are inadequate. We're wasting extraordinary resources by allowing economic desperation and institutional assumptions to hide expertise. This isn't just unfair to individuals, it's inefficient for organizations and harmful to society." General Matthews nodded, understanding that Maria's analysis had moved far beyond their original Pentagon context. The principles they had discovered applied to hospitals that overlooked the medical knowledge of immigrant nurses working as cleaners, to schools that didn't recognize the teaching expertise of substitute custodians with advanced degrees, to corporations that missed opportunities because they didn't look beyond traditional recruitment channels. The real measure of their success, however, wasn't the national attention or policy discussions. It was the personal transformations that had followed from that first moment of recognition in the Pentagon hallway. Maria's daughter Rosa had graduated from medical school with honors and was beginning a residency in pediatric medicine, following a path that had seemed impossible when her mother was working custodial shifts to pay for basic necessities. Rosa's medical school essays had focused on serving immigrant communities, inspired by watching her mother return to using her medical skills for humanitarian purposes. Carmen had been accepted to MIT's engineering program with a full scholarship, supported by recommendations from Pentagon officers who had been impressed by her mother's analytical capabilities and her own mathematical talents. Carmen planned to specialize in infrastructure development for refugee communities, combining her technical skills with insights gained from her mother's experience. But the transformation extended beyond Maria's family. The Pentagon's Hidden Expertise Initiative had become a model for other institutions facing complex challenges that required diverse perspectives and unconventional solutions. Universities were reviewing their staff to identify and use academic expertise. Hospitals were discovering that some of their custodial and food service workers possessed medical training that could be utilized in supportive roles. Corporations were finding that immigrant employees often brought knowledge of international markets and cultural dynamics that could improve their global operations. The program had also influenced military recruitment and retention strategies. Pentagon officials realized that their assumptions about where useful expertise could be found had been limiting their effectiveness in humanitarian operations, cultural engagement, and international cooperation. They began actively seeking military personnel and civilian employees who brought diverse educational backgrounds and international experience, regardless of how those qualifications fit traditional career pathways. General Matthews, now promoted to head the Pentagon's new Office of Human Capital Optimization, oversaw programs that had identified and deployed hidden expertise throughout the military establishment. Her approach had been studied by leadership programs at West Point and the Naval Academy, where it was taught as an example of how effective commanders could improve organizational performance by challenging assumptions about capability and worth. But perhaps the most meaningful validation came from an unexpected source. 6 months after receiving the Presidential Medal of Freedom, Maria was contacted by the World Health Organization, which had heard about her work on refugee health management through military channels. WHO officials wanted her to lead a new initiative developing medical response protocols for displaced populations worldwide. The position would require her to travel to refugee camps in multiple countries, working with local medical personnel and international organizations to develop treatment strategies that could be implemented effectively in resource-limited environments. It was exactly the kind of work she had dreamed of doing when she first became a doctor, but with resources and institutional support she had never imagined possible. Standing in her Pentagon office, the same hallway where she had once pushed a cleaning cart, Maria looked out the window and thought about the invisible people who were still waiting to be seen. The Hidden Expertise Initiative had identified and utilized the capabilities of several hundred individuals throughout the federal government, but Maria understood that they had only scratched the surface of wasted human potential. Every day, she encountered people whose talents were hidden by language barriers, economic necessity, credential recognition problems, or simple institutional blindness. The security guard who spoke 5 languages fluently, but wasn't utilized for international communications. The cafeteria worker who had managed supply chains in her home country, but couldn't get her experience recognized by American employers. The maintenance staff member who had engineering training but couldn't afford the licensing requirements to work in his field. General Matthews had proven that institutional change was possible when leaders were willing to look beyond conventional assumptions. But Maria knew that sustainable transformation would require more than individual leaders making exceptional decisions. It would require systematic changes to how institutions identified, developed, and utilized human capital. As she prepared for her new role with the World Health Organization, Maria was already planning how she could use her platform to advocate for broader recognition of hidden expertise. Her story had become proof that extraordinary capability existed in unexpected places, but, more importantly, it had demonstrated that institutions could benefit dramatically when they created pathways for that capability to be expressed. The woman who had spent 7 years invisible in the Pentagon's hallways was about to become visible on the world stage, leading international efforts to improve humanitarian medical response. But she would never forget that her transformation had begun with one moment of recognition from a leader who chose to see value where others saw only service. General Patricia Matthews often reflected on how a simple conversation about spilled coffee had led to organizational changes affecting thousands of people worldwide. Her mother Dorothy had been right. The people who kept institutions running often knew things that the people who ran institutions never thought to ask about. The question was whether leaders were wise enough to ask, brave enough to listen, and committed enough to act on what they learned. As Maria boarded a plane for her first WHO assignment in Jordan, she carried with her not just medical supplies and treatment protocols, but a story that proved invisible people could become essential contributors when someone with authority decided they were worth seeing. The ripple effects of that recognition would continue to spread, challenging assumptions and changing lives in ways that no one could have imagined when a 4-star general chose to notice a custodian who worked with unusual dignity and skill. The last entry in Maria's Pentagon office log read simply, Dr. Maria Santos, Consultant, Humanitarian Medical Operations. But beneath that official title was a truth that General Matthews had understood from their first conversation. Sometimes the most important expertise exists in the most unexpected places, waiting for someone with enough wisdom to recognize that human capability cannot be measured by job titles, uniforms, or assumptions about who deserves to be heard. In the end, Maria Santos had not just become visible. She had helped make visible the thousands of other invisible experts whose talents were waiting to be discovered, whose contributions were waiting to be valued, and whose potential was waiting for leaders brave enough to look beyond appearances and see the extraordinary capabilities that exist in ordinary places.